One morning in the spring of 1986, a 46-year-old Canadian woman named Alina Atkinson softly closed the door to her teenage son Jacob's bedroom. Jacob had recently been in a terrible car accident and was bedridden with his injuries. Doctors had told Alina and her husband Tyler that Jacob would require around-the-clock care to recuperate, and so even though Alina had a very busy professional career as a biologist, she had taken a leave of absence to tend to her son. It had been a very abrupt life change for her, but she was grateful she was even able to do that. However, Jacob, luckily, was healing faster than doctors expected, and so now he just spent most of his time in bed, not needing any direct care from Alina. That left Alina with a lot of hours during the day to kinda do nothing. She didn't really need to look after her son, and her husband was away most of the day in Vancouver at the university where he taught mathematics. And so for a while, Alina had spent this unexpected free time reading or just playing the piano. But then she had found her old paint set from high school in the garage. As a teenager, Alina had been an avid painter. And so she figured, with all this extra free time, maybe now is a good time to rekindle her passion. Now, initially, she painted homes, buildings, and churches in a realistic architectural style. But in the last couple of weeks, she'd been experimenting with painting new things and using new brushwork techniques. And for some reason, as she was trying out new things, she became obsessed with strawberries. It was like every time she painted a strawberry, the more obsessed with them she became. She found an almost infinite subtlety in every detail of its form. The spacing of the seeds, the specific shade of red, the tuft of green petals at the top. It was like every time she sat down to paint, she would consider painting other subjects, but she just couldn't get the strawberries out of her mind. And so she would just paint more strawberries. Now, Alina didn't know if this meant anything, but she didn't question it. She just did what her brain told her to do. 1 year later, on a warm summer night, Alina stood with her husband in a brightly lit white rectangular room. It was the opening night of her first solo art show at a local Vancouver gallery. Tyler tapped his plastic cup of white wine against hers and whistled in awe at the walls filled with her amazing artwork. The paintings were filled with detail. There were paintings of houses ringed in seas of brightly colored flowers, with every petal carefully shaded. There were these kaleidoscopic circular paintings of roots and mushrooms and octopuses, and there were paintings of leaves and bark and tropical fish, all rendered in a similarly obsessive way. They were undoubtedly beautiful, but full of so much detail, it almost looked kind of manic. Now, Alina didn't really understand where this intense creative drive was coming from. I mean, she had wanted to get back into painting, but didn't expect to be so head over heels in love with it again. But she was very proud of what she'd made. Months earlier, when Jacob had recovered enough to return to high school, Alina realized something big. She didn't want to go back to her old life. She used to love working as a biologist, but now, compared to how she felt while she was painting, it was awful, and she couldn't go back. And so Alina had quit her job and spent every day since obsessively creating art. The process was thrilling to her, and it kept expanding. Alina didn't want to do anything else. Sometimes her husband seemed a bit bewildered by her devotion to her craft, but Alina didn't mind. She felt too inspired to care. Just then, the director of the gallery interrupted the couple's moment with good news. Several of Alina's paintings had just sold. Her show was a hit. Seven years later, on a drizzly winter morning in 1994, Alina was in the kitchen making toast and envisioning her day in the art studio. The house was quiet, except for a small radio that Alina kept tuned to the classical music station. And after a while, she realized she'd been listening to the same piece of music for what felt like a really long time. She stared at the radio and focused on what she was hearing. The song was a strange hypnotic march with a rolling staccato snare drum carrying a melody of flutes and bells. Across almost 15 minutes, the song swelled and snowballed, adding more and more instruments until it crescendoed in a bombastic parade of sound and then crashed into silence. When the music finally stopped, the DJ identified the song as Bolero by the French composer Maurice Ravel, composed in 1928. Alina had never felt so moved by a piece of music ever in her life. Something about this bolero had affected her in a profound way. She poured herself a mug of tea and then hurried to the studio. She had an idea. 3 weeks later, Alina perched on a stool in her studio with a brush in her hand, her face inches from the canvas. On the shelf by the window, her CD player was switched to repeat mode to play the same track over and over, which was, of course, Ravel's Bolero. It was the only music Alina had listened to for weeks. It was also the subject of her latest painting that she had been working on for weeks. The painting was supposed to be a visual representation of the song Bolero. Each note was depicted as a different color. For instance, B-flat was metallic green. The duration of the song was expressed as a series of rectangles stacked on top of each other. The height of each shape represented the loudness of the instruments. Alina listened to Bolero hundreds and hundreds of times to create her visual coding system. This required an extreme level of focus, but Alina had never felt so inspired. She felt like she was making her masterpiece. The most challenging part, though, was translating the climax of Bolero to painting. During the climax, the music becomes dense and dramatic, with crashing drums and instruments overlapping with one another. Alina conveyed this chaos by making her map of shapes and colors grow larger and larger and then start to sort of fall apart, like a scarf unraveling. And one night, while staring at the painting, the title of it came to her. She called it Unraveling Bolero. 6 years later, on a weekend afternoon in the year 2000, Tyler was making lunch for his wife. Unraveling Bolero had become a small sensation in the art world, and since its release, Alina's career had steadily grown. After knocking on his wife's studio door, Tyler nudged it open and went inside. As always, Alina was in front of her easel with a large palette of paints beside her. Tyler asked her what she wanted for lunch, but at first, she didn't seem to hear him. When he asked again, she simply blurted out a string of words. Sandwich, apple, tea. Back in the kitchen, Tyler kept thinking about Alina's response. He had noticed his wife had seemed less talkative lately, but he had assumed she was just lost in thoughts about her work. Now, he wasn't so sure. A year later, Tyler's brother and wife were visiting from out of state for the holidays. Tyler asked Alina to take a break from painting so they could spend some time together, and she had agreed. While Tyler waited for her to finish up in the studio, he opened up a bottle of wine and lit a fire in the fireplace. When Alina emerged and joined them, Tyler's brother asked her what she'd been working on. Alina opened her mouth to explain, but then she just cocked her head to the side as if she was trying to remember what she was going to say. Then, instead of actually speaking, she began tracing a triangular shape in the air, like she was playing a game of charades. Tyler couldn't tell if his wife was just being playful or something, but he translated for her. He explained to his brother that Alina's new painting was of some friends on vacation in Egypt, in front of the pyramids, hence the triangle. Now, Alina would eventually regain her speech, and so everyone just kind of forgot about this weird moment, but Tyler didn't. He kept thinking about the way Alina had become momentarily speechless. He couldn't help but feel like something was happening to his wife. He just didn't understand what. Another year later, one evening in the fall of 2002, Tyler went into Alina's studio to discuss their dinner plans for the night. He suggested a couple of local spots, then asked if she had a craving for anything specific. And he watched as Alina didn't answer him, and then she began to furrow her brow and began to look really frustrated. Tyler asked her again, thinking maybe she hadn't heard him or didn't understand, but this time his wife just grabbed a pad of paper and began sketching something. Seconds later, she held up a drawing of a hamburger. At this point, Tyler was genuinely disturbed. This no longer felt like maybe his wife being eccentric. It seemed like his wife, again, was suddenly unable to talk. And so, acting on instinct, he told his wife he was going to call her doctor. And Alina simply nodded and turned back to her canvas. A few weeks later, a neurologist named Dr. Brad Milhauser sat in his office in San Francisco, across from Alina and Tyler, who had traveled all the way from Canada to see him. Dr. Milhauser's specialty was treating unusual brain conditions. He listened while Tyler described what was going on with his wife. As for Alina, she just sat there quietly watching her husband speak. She could no longer string together phrases longer than 3 or 4 words, and so Tyler had become the family's default spokesperson. Tyler told Dr. Milhauser about his wife's sudden career change, from cellular biologist to artist. and her gradual loss of language that followed. When expressing herself visually, Alina was vivid and creative, but when using language, Alina had become totally confused. As Tyler explained the evolution of Alina's artwork, he listed some of her favorite subject matter: houses, flowers, strawberries, and bolero. Alina brightened at the mention of bolero. She quickly reached for a pen and notepad on the desk and began sketching an outline of her painting. Dr. Milhauser watched as Alina carefully rendered each square and triangle in precise proportions. He was impressed by how tunnel-visioned her focus became when locked into her work. But her specific fascination with bolero gave him an idea. Dr. Milhauser had actually studied Maurice Ravel before, the artist behind the piece Bolero. But he had studied him from a medical perspective, not a musical one. The doctor had a hunch that the parallel between the famed French composer and Alina might run deeper than anyone realized. While Alina continued sketching, Dr. Milhauser told her husband that he wanted to do some brain scans on Alina. If what he suspected was true, Maurice Ravel could be the clue to her mysterious condition. Days later, after studying the results of Alina's brain scans, Dr. Milhauser knew he had been correct. Alina's diagnosis was a brain disease known as frontotemporal dementia. Alina's brain scan showed significant damage to her frontal cortex, which is the part of the brain responsible for speech and language. When cells in the frontal cortex begin to wither and die, language skills quickly decline. What causes frontotemporal dementia is not still fully known, but some doctors think it's due to the buildup of abnormal proteins in the brain. One surprising side effect of this disease is that as the language processing part of the brain weakens, other areas sometimes become stronger to compensate. For instance, the part related to processing visual information or the area that processes sound can become much sharper, leading to unexpected surges of creativity. But these bursts can express themselves in extreme or obsessive ways, such as repeating a single idea over and over again, like Alina's paintings of countless strawberries, or Maurice Ravel's Bolero, which repeats the first melody 9 times. What Dr. Milhauser knew from his studies was that Maurice Ravel also suffered from frontotemporal dementia. In 1933, 6 years after composing Bolero, Ravel's mental health began deteriorating. Within 2 years, Ravel couldn't write or speak. Although brain scanning technology didn't exist during Ravel's lifetime, a French surgeon examined the composer's brain just before his death in 1937. In his notes, the surgeon described 2 of the lobes in Ravel's brain as being sunken. Ravel and Alina's unraveling were almost identical. A spike of artistic vision followed by a sudden loss of language. The fact that Alina based her most famous painting on Bolero was the clue to her diagnosis, but it was also a cosmically strange coincidence. Despite identifying Alina's condition, there was unfortunately nothing that doctors could do to reverse it. She gradually lost control of the entire right side of her body, and then she entirely lost the ability to talk or even understand words. All the while, Alina continued to paint. But by 2005, Alina's body had degenerated so badly that she finally stopped painting. And then 2 years after that, Alina Atkinson died. Almost 70 years to the month after her inspiration, Maurice Ravel, also died. To this day, her painting, Unraveling Bolero, hangs in Dr. Milhauser's office, a fitting place for a work of art that reminds us how huge a role brain activity plays in creativity. And now for our second story, called Crossing Over. One morning in September of 2019, a 33-year-old man named Daniel Flores stumbled into the lobby of a busy emergency room in Boston, Massachusetts. He was delirious, soaked in sweat, and clutching his stomach in obvious pain. As he waited in line to sign in, Daniel's chest started to heave. All of a sudden, he could barely breathe. Before he could call for help, his vision turned blurry, and he collapsed to the floor. Moments later, he felt people lifting him up, placing him in a wheelchair, and rushing him through a series of swinging doors. The hospital swirled around him in a haze of voices, bodies, and fluorescent lights as someone placed an oxygen mask over his mouth. Soon, Daniel found himself lying on a bed in a small room while a man in a white coat spoke to him. Daniel assumed he was the doctor, but he wasn't sure because Daniel didn't speak English. The doctor seemed to realize Daniel was not understanding him, so he stepped out into the hallway and yelled something, and Daniel caught one familiar word: Español. Soon, a young male nurse hurried into the room and introduced himself in Spanish. He said that he would be Daniel's interpreter. After grabbing a clipboard off the counter, the nurse asked Daniel how long he'd been experiencing his symptoms. Daniel removed his oxygen mask and told him that he'd been feeling nauseous ever since arriving in Massachusetts 4 days ago with his wife and kids. And then once they had actually gotten to Boston 2 days earlier, it had only gotten worse, and he had begun coughing up blood. At first, it had been bright red, but over the past 2 days, the blood had only gotten darker. This morning, before coming to the hospital, the blood looked brown and gritty, almost like coffee grounds. The interpreter nodded and relayed this information to the doctor. The doctor listened intently, then said something to the interpreter. The interpreter then turned to Daniel and asked him about his medical history. Specifically, he wanted to know if Daniel smoked, drank, or took drugs. Daniel hesitated to tell the truth, but he decided he would trust the interpreter. He admitted that although he had recently quit, for 15 years, Daniel had smoked a pack of cigarettes a day. He also drank daily, at least 2 or 3 drinks. After this, the interpreter and the doctor began speaking to each other. Daniel obviously didn't know what they were saying, but their voices sounded serious, which made him feel nervous. Eventually, the interpreter turned back to Daniel. He told Daniel that coughing up blood often indicates bleeding inside of the digestive tract, which can be life-threatening. In order to find out more, the doctor wanted to run some tests, and Daniel agreed. After the doctor left to go arrange the tests, the interpreter flipped to a new page of Daniel's patient intake form, and his next question was about Daniel's family history. However, Daniel really didn't want to answer. He knew that if right now he said the wrong thing, he and his family could be in a lot of trouble with immigration officials. About an hour later, Dr. Nicholas Hunt opened up an image on his computer. He was studying an X-ray the lab had just sent him of a new patient, Daniel Flores. After conducting a physical exam where he noticed that Daniel was feverish, had trouble breathing, and had a heart rate that was higher than normal, Daniel had also flinched when Dr. Hunt pressed on his abdomen. It seemed to him that Daniel's body was breaking down in several ways simultaneously, but he wasn't sure why. Dr. Hunt knew he would need to narrow down the options before Daniel's symptoms worsened. As Dr. Hunt examined the X-ray, he couldn't help but feel like the image was pretty worrying. Both of Daniel's lungs looked patchy and opaque. That meant they were infected, possibly with pneumonia, or even something more serious. As a precaution, Dr. Hunt put Daniel on a regimen of broad-spectrum antibiotics that would hopefully slow any infection while Dr. Hunt figured out what was wrong. Just then, the doctor got another email. It was another test result from the lab, Daniel's blood test, and none of it was good news. The test indicated that Daniel had low levels of sodium and potassium, which suggested mild kidney damage. Daniel's liver enzyme levels were much higher than they should have been too, which meant he also might have liver damage, possibly from years of daily drinking. Daniel showed high levels of a type of white blood cell called neutrophils, which are part of the immune system's response to infections. And so it looked to Dr. Hunt like Daniel's body was trying to fight something off. But his long years of drinking and smoking had very likely left his immune system dangerously weakened. It was clear to Dr. Hunt that the clock was ticking for Daniel Flores. He wanted to help, but he still didn't know what he was up against. Dr. Hunt shared Daniel's test results with a colleague, an internist named Marissa Kaneko. Dr. Hunt had already forwarded her Daniel's medical file so that she could help determine if Daniel's kidney or liver damage might be causing internal bleeding. Dr. Kaneko said she found Daniel's lab results equally worrying, and the source of the bleeding needed to be found quickly. And so she recommended to Dr. Hunt that Daniel have either a bronchoscopy or an upper endoscopy so the doctors could have a look inside of him. A bronchoscopy is a procedure that uses a thin, flexible tube mounted with a camera, called a bronchoscope, to examine the lungs and throat. An upper endoscopy would be similar, but would examine the digestive tract. Dr. Hunt agreed with her idea. 1 hour later, Dr. Kaneko stood above Daniel in the operating room, gently guiding the bronchoscope down his throat as her sedated patient lay perfectly still. She watched the bronchoscope's progress on a small monitor positioned above Daniel's bed. As the tube found its way inside of Daniel's lungs, Dr. Kaneko saw streaks of dark red lining the inside. It's what she was afraid of finding. They were bloody secretions from decades of heavy smoking. Dr. Kaneko maneuvered the bronchoscope as delicately as possible to collect fluid samples for testing. But even the softest touch of the scope against Daniel's lung tissue triggered even more bleeding. On the monitor, she could see blood was actually oozing from the tiny air sacs in the lungs called alveoli. This was clearly more than damage from just smoking. Something else was causing Daniel's lungs to hemorrhage blood. If she couldn't identify the cause, Daniel could easily bleed to death. However, there were a lot of options to weed out. This type of hemorrhaging was a common symptom of many infectious diseases, from something common like pneumonia to rare autoimmune conditions such as vasculitis and Goodpasture syndrome, and even a potentially fatal condition called acute respiratory distress syndrome. Dr. Kaneko carefully retracted the bronchoscope up and out of Daniel's esophagus. Then a nurse wheeled Daniel back to his room. At this point, the doctor had successfully confirmed that there was something critically wrong with Daniel, putting him in immediate danger of death. However, that knowledge didn't put them any closer to finding a cure. That night, after making the rounds to visit his other patients, Dr. Hunt returned to Daniel's room. Daniel's skin was now yellowish, a sign that his liver was failing, and his eyelids drooped. He looked exhausted, and frankly much worse than he had looked during the bronchoscopy only a few hours earlier. Dr. Hunt wrapped a blood pressure cuff around Daniel's bicep. He inflated it, then watched the gauge while listening to Daniel's blood flow with his stethoscope. He tried not to show any outward signs of worry on his face when he saw that Daniel's blood pressure had dropped significantly. Dr. Hunt also noticed Daniel's breathing had become raspy and shallow. He placed his stethoscope on Daniel's chest and listened. Between breaths, he heard a brittle, crackling sound, which indicated fluid building up in Daniel's lungs. All of Daniel's organs seemed to be losing the battle against whatever was attacking them. Dr. Hunt decided to run an emergency blood test to check on his patient's failing kidneys. This time, the news was even worse. Daniel's kidneys had shut down. Dr. Hunt immediately ordered Daniel to be put on dialysis. Without working kidneys to filter his body's waste, Daniel could develop a condition called uremia, which can lead to seizures, comas, and often death. A nurse promptly wheeled Daniel's bed to an operating room where a surgeon would connect the dialysis machine while Dr. Hunt's mind raced to figure out what was wrong with Daniel. And he knew he did not have much time left. A few hours later, Dr. Hunt sipped a cup of lukewarm coffee as Daniel lay nearly unconscious while a dialysis machine filtered his blood. Dr. Hunt felt tired and confused. Daniel's symptoms were so extensive and serious that it was difficult to narrow it down to a single cause. Dr. Hunt had ordered lab technicians to run tests for Daniel of virtually every autoimmune disease, but the results kept coming back negative. Early the following morning, the on-duty nurse notified Dr. Hunt that Daniel's oxygen levels had plummeted. His lungs were now too weak to process oxygen. If it went on much longer, the lack of oxygen in Daniel's blood would cause permanent damage to his brain. Dr. Hunt ordered Daniel to be intubated to help with his breathing and then transferred to the ICU. In the 24 hours since Daniel had stumbled into the hospital, his condition had only grown steadily worse. If Dr. Hunt didn't come up with something quick, it was unlikely Daniel would survive much longer. Alejandra Flores could not believe her eyes when she walked into the ICU. Her husband Daniel was unconscious, hooked up to a room full of machines with tubes in his arms and down his throat. He was unable to speak. He looked more dead than alive. The day before, when Daniel had told her he was going to the hospital, Alejandra agreed that he did seem sick, but she assumed it was just a bad flu, or at least it was just something that could be treated, so she didn't go with him. But when she didn't hear from him by that evening, she had begun to worry. And then she realized that she didn't even know for sure which hospital he went to. And after only being in the US for 4 days, neither her nor Daniel had a phone, so she couldn't call to find out. And so by today, the following day, with still no word from her husband, Alejandra had panicked. Fortunately, though, Daniel had been clear-headed enough to give the interpreter the phone number at their extended family's apartment where his wife and his family were staying. And so when Alejandra had answered the phone that morning, a Spanish-speaking nurse from the hospital explained her husband's situation. Alejandra was horrified. She left the kids at the apartment and hurried to the hospital. Sitting beside Daniel's bed, Alejandra stroked his hand and prayed. She felt helpless and lost in this strange new place. A few minutes later, a nurse entered and introduced himself as the person Alejandra had spoken to on the phone. Behind him was an older man in a white coat, Daniel's doctor. The nurse told her there wasn't any time to waste. Daniel was dying, and the hospital could not figure out why. And so to help them, they needed more information about Daniel. Alejandra agreed to help them, but in her head, her husband's warning echoed. Daniel had coached her repeatedly before they'd come to Massachusetts from Mexico to never reveal personal information if asked by any authority figure. Saying the wrong thing could get them into serious trouble. But now, looking at Daniel, pale and lifeless on the bed, Alejandra could tell this was a different situation. The stakes were too high to hide something that might save the father of her kids. So, Alejandra caved and told them her family's story. Dr. Hunt sat there silently, listening closely to every word the translator spoke. Then he thanked Alejandra for sharing and promised he would not tell anyone else, and that thanks to her, he actually could save Daniel's life. A couple hours later, the results of Daniel's latest blood test came back, and Dr. Hunt finally knew what was making him sick. A deadly disease that is almost unheard of in the United States. The condition, called leptospirosis, is a bacterial disease responsible for nearly 60,000 deaths per year around the world. It's most commonly spread through the urine of infected animals like rats, cattle, dogs, and pigs. The disease-causing bacteria is particularly common in bodies of water after heavy rains, when runoff from farms flows into streams and rivers. And thanks to Alejandra's story, Dr. Hunt knew that Daniel had been in a particularly big river recently. Until last month, she and Daniel had lived their whole lives in central Mexico. But when Daniel lost his job there, they decided to take a chance and travel north in search of better opportunities. They had hiked, climbed, run, and paid strangers for rides across long distances. But when they finally reached the Mexico-Texas border, there was still one more wide, muddy obstacle standing between them and their new life in America, the Rio Grande River. To avoid being spotted, they had to cross at night. Alejandra and Daniel and their kids stuffed all their possessions into plastic bags, then hiked to a bend in the river where the water was slower, and waded in and swam as quickly and quietly as they could across. And that's when Daniel was very likely infected with the leptospirosis. Alejandra and the kids just happened to get lucky and dodged it. But Daniel was not so lucky, developing symptoms just days after his swim and coming to the brink of multi-organ failure in less than a week. But after 6 weeks of intensive antibiotics, Daniel was finally released from the hospital and made a full recovery. His journey to America had nearly killed him, but sharing the truth of his family's story ultimately saved his life. In October of 2002, Mark and his wife Kathy were on their way to a baby shower in Baltimore, Maryland that was being held for them by Kathy's family. It would be a 7-hour drive from their home in Ohio, so Mark and Kathy tried to get out the door as early as possible, but one thing led to another and they got a pretty late start. By midnight, they were only about an hour away from their final destination, but they both desperately needed a bathroom break. And so they pulled into a rest stop in Frederick County, Maryland, which is about an hour outside of Washington, D.C. The rest area parking lot was completely vacant except for one car, which was a dark blue late model 4-door sedan that was parked head-in right in front of the bathroom. Mark and Kathy pulled into a spot that was a few over from the sedan. They got out, they walked up to the restroom. Mark was done first, so he waited outside of the women's restroom for his wife. As he waited, he turned around to face the sedan that initially, when he first pulled in the lot, he believed was empty. But now, as he's looking at it, he can clearly see there are 2 people in the front 2 seats. A middle-aged man who's sitting behind the steering wheel looking directly at Mark, and then next to this guy is a sleeping teenager. And immediately, Mark felt really creeped out by these 2 guys. I mean, they are in this random rest stop in the middle of the night. They're the only ones there, and this guy is just staring menacingly at Mark. And so Mark's doing his best not to be intimidated and to stand his ground and not act fazed by what's happening right in front of him. But in the back of his mind, he is just praying his wife comes out of that bathroom as soon as possible so they can get the heck out of here and away from these two creepy guys. Finally, his wife did come out. He grabbed her by the hand and without any explanation, rushed them back to their car, hopped in, locked the doors, turned it on, and began backing out. And as he did, he looked over at the sedan and he saw the guy behind the steering wheel, the middle-aged guy, was looking over at Mark with that same menacing look on his face. Mark also noticed there was something odd about the sedan's trunk. There was a fist-size hole right above the license plate where you would normally put the key inside of. So the whole scene was just totally bizarre, and after Mark and Kathy sped out and were back on the highway, Mark explained to Kathy that there were actually two people inside of that sedan and they really creeped him out, and that's why he had grabbed her and rushed them back into the car. And so she agreed that was pretty creepy, but by the time the couple got to the baby shower in Baltimore, they had completely forgotten about their experience at the rest stop. The baby shower went well, and before long, Mark and Kathy were back home in Ohio. About a week later, the couple was watching TV in their home when a breaking news bulletin came across, and it showed a reporter who was standing at the exact same rest stop that they had stopped in on the way to Baltimore in Frederick County, Maryland, and behind them was the same late model sedan that they had seen parked at that rest stop when they had pulled in. The headline of this special news bulletin was "DC Snipers Caught." It would turn out that middle-aged man sitting in the driver's seat of the sedan staring at Mark was none other than John Allen Muhammad, and the guy next to him, the teenager who was sleeping, was Lee Boyd Malvo. These were the two men that were responsible for the highly coordinated 3-week-long attack that left 10 people dead in the Washington, D.C. area. The fist-size hole that Mark saw on the back of their trunk was what they used to shoot through because it allowed them to stay concealed in the trunk while they were shooting. Mohammed and Malvo had been using that particular rest stop in Frederick County as a place to hide out in between their killings. When Mark and Kathy pulled in next to them, they were only halfway through their killing spree. Mark believes the only reason he and his wife were not targeted is because the killers most likely were trying to keep this rest stop off the radar because it was their hiding spot, and so they wouldn't have risked an attack there. Although, ironically, they would ultimately be caught in that rest stop. Mohammed was executed by lethal injection in 2009, and Malvo is serving a life sentence. In 1988, 35-year-old Ivan McGuire was an experienced skydiving instructor with over 700 jumps to his name. On April 5th of that year, he was working in North Carolina, and he was tasked with filming other instructors and their students after they jumped out of the plane. The way this worked is Ivan would go up in the plane with the instructor and their student, and Ivan would be the first to leap out of the plane. He would roll onto his back, and he would film upward towards the plane, and he would capture the student and instructor jumping out, and Ivan would continue to film them until they pulled their chutes, at which point he would pull his. Now, being 1988, the filming equipment that Ivan was using was much larger and more cumbersome than something you would use today. He had a voice-activated camera attached to his helmet, and then from there was a cord going to this big heavy VHS deck that he kept in a backpack. But despite the nuisance of the equipment, Ivan went up with the first student and instructor and successfully filmed their jump. When he got back on the ground, Ivan went over to the riggers and he gave them his parachute so they could pack it for him, and then Ivan went over to a bench and began fiddling with his camera equipment. It was clear he was frustrated with the way it was set up and he was making all sorts of adjustments. When it was time for Ivan's second jump of the day with a new instructor and new student, he was so preoccupied with fiddling with his camera that he forgot to grab his parachute. And so he ran over to the plane and he's about to get on, and they say, "Hey, Ivan, you're not wearing a parachute." And he goes, "Oh my goodness, you're right." He runs back over, he gets his parachute, he loads back in the plane, he goes up to altitude, and then he jumps out, he films the instructor and student, it all goes great, he makes it to the ground, and his second jump is a success. And just like after the first jump of the day, Ivan takes off his parachute, he gives it to the riggers, and then he goes and sits down on a bench and continues to fidget and fiddle around with his camera equipment. When it was time for Ivan's third jump of the day with yet another new instructor and student, this time he grabbed his parachute, put all of his gear on, ran over to the plane, hopped on board, and he took off. Once they got up to their jumping altitude, which was 10,500 feet, Ivan turned on his camera, and the footage shows the instructor and the student kind of getting their gear together, sitting across from him in the plane. The jump master towards the front of the plane slides open the side door. Ivan, who's going to be the first one out, makes his way to the edge. He turns himself upside down, so he's sitting basically with his back outside of the plane. He makes sure the instructor and student are right on top of him, ready to jump out right afterwards. Once they're ready, Ivan falls out backwards and continues to film. film. You see the instructor and student jump out right afterwards. Ivan continues to film them as they go down. They're in free fall for a few seconds, and then you see the instructor and student pull their parachutes, at which time Ivan reaches back to pull his own, but he can't find it. For a few seconds he flails, and you can see his hands coming out in front of the camera, and he's trying to reach for his ripcord, and then he realizes what's happened. That parachute he grabbed before he loaded up in the plane was not a parachute. He grabbed his heavy backpack that had that big VHS deck in it, and when he put it on, he mistook it for the parachute. And so now, falling at terminal velocity with no way to stop himself, he begins yelling out, "Oh no, oh God, no!" And he keeps reaching back as if he's just gonna find this cord, but there's nothing there. And after a few agonizing seconds, you see the ground getting closer and closer and closer, and then it cuts out. Ivan's body was later found about 1.5 miles outside of the drop zone in the woods. His camera and videotape were severely damaged, but they were able to splice it together, and that's why we know what happened in his final moments. An investigation into his death showed the pilot made the same mistake Ivan did. When he saw Ivan with that backpack on, he assumed it was a parachute, and so ultimately Ivan's death was ruled an accident. Fair warning, if you look into this case, you will almost certainly come across the actual footage of Ivan's final jump. In 1980, Bobby Shafran was on his way up to Sullivan County Community College, which is 2 hours outside of New York City, to begin his freshman year. Even though he was from the area, he didn't know anybody that was going to this particular school, and so he was pretty nervous about it. Plus, he wasn't that popular in high school, and he had a hard time making friends. When he pulled into a parking spot at the school, he saw a sea of people getting out of their parents' cars and carrying boxes up to their dorm rooms. And so he took a deep breath, hopped out of his car, grabbed his backpack, and began walking across the lawn towards the dorm building. On his walk over, Bobby was surprised when he felt like all these random strangers on the lawn were looking at him like they knew him. And a couple people yelled out to him and said, "Hey, it's good to have you back here." And one girl actually ran up to him and kissed him on the cheek and said, "Oh my gosh, I'm so happy you're back." And Bobby said, "I think you got the wrong person. I don't know you." And she laughed and she just ran away. And so Bobby's totally bewildered by this because he doesn't know anybody, but everybody seems to know him. And so he walks up the steps and he goes inside the dorm building. And as he's walking down the hall, people are high-fiving him and patting him on the back. And then right as he's about to turn the corner towards his actual dorm room, someone down the hall behind him yells out, "Hey, Eddie, what's going on, man?" And Bobby knew whoever it was yelling at him. Because this whole situation had been so weird, he felt like this had to be a case of mistaken identity. And so Bobby turned around and he saw at the other end of the hall another student who he didn't know, clearly waving at him and yelling out, "Hey, Eddie, come here, what's going on, man?" And so Bobby walks up to him and says, "Hey, I'm not Eddie. I don't know what's going on, but everybody thinks I'm somebody that I'm not, but I'm not Eddie. Who's Eddie?" And the guy said, "Yeah, okay, Eddie, it's good to have you back here, man," and then walked off. And so Bobby's like, what is going on here? And so Bobby turns and he goes back up to his dorm room and he goes inside and he just shuts the door and he's thinking, I just want to be left alone for a second because this is not right. This is not how a freshman who doesn't know anyone gets welcomed at any school or any place in the world. This is totally unusual. And just a couple of minutes after being inside of his dorm room, he hears a knock on the door and Bobby's like, oh great, who is it now? Who is it that thinks I'm someone I'm not? So he opens the door and there's another student who he doesn't know who's standing there, and this guy, his face just drains of color and he starts shaking when he sees Bobby. And they're both looking at each other like, what's going on here? And the student says to Bobby, were you adopted? And Bobby said, yeah. And then the student said, is your birthday July 12th? And Bobby said, yeah. And so the student goes, okay, my name is Michael and I am best friends with a guy named Eddie Galland, and you are his clone. You have got to be his identical twin. At this point, to Bobby, this almost made sense, but it was so crazy to imagine having some identical twin he didn't know about. And so Bobby asked Michael if he could go meet Eddie because he's got to be a student here. And Michael said, well, actually, Eddie decided not to come back to school this year, which is probably why everyone you talked to was so excited to see you because they love Eddie and they thought you were him, and so they're psyched to have you back. After talking for a couple of minutes, Michael tells Bobby that they have to go call Eddie and they have to set up a meeting so that Bobby can meet Eddie and vice versa. And so Michael and Bobby run outside to a payphone booth. They hop inside, they're crammed in there, and they dial up Eddie. And as soon as Eddie answers, Bobby grabs the phone and just says, hey Eddie, my name's Bobby and everybody thinks I'm you. And then Eddie says, yeah, I've been getting a lot of calls about that too. And Bobby would later say that when he first heard Eddie's voice, he said it sounded like his own voice coming through the phone. And so ultimately, Eddie invited Bobby and Michael to come to his house so that Eddie and Bobby could see if it really was true that they were twins. And so Michael and Bobby hopped in Bobby's car and they sped 2 hours to Eddie's house. And when they got there, it was the middle of the night, and Eddie's house is the only house in this quiet suburb that has all the lights on. And so Michael and Bobby walk up the path towards the front door of Eddie's house, and right as Bobby is about to knock on the door, it flies open, and standing in front of Bobby is his exact clone. It's Eddie. And Eddie's looking back at Bobby, and he can't believe what he's looking at. They are definitely identical twins, and they both immediately saw that. Michael would say after Bobby and Eddie just stared at each other for about a minute, they just started laughing. It was like they were total strangers, but at the same time, they had this connection immediately. They knew they were related, and they were laughing, and they hugged, and they just stared at each other. And Michael said anytime Bobby would tilt his head, Eddie would mimic it, and vice versa. It was like they were looking into a mirror. Shortly after, this story of these two long-lost brothers reconnecting found its way to Newsday, which was a prominent local newspaper in New York, and they decided they would look into it to see if it was really true or not. And so one of the editors had a junior reporter fly out and actually see Bobby and Eddie face to face and see if it was really true that they were in fact identical twins. And as soon as this reporter saw them, they knew immediately that, yep, they're related. And so Newsday printed this totally heartwarming fairy tale story about these two long-lost brothers reconnected after all these years just because of a chance encounter in college. And everybody loved it. But this is where the story went from amazing to truly unbelievable. Friends of another young man living in the New York area named David Kelman began telling David that he had to check out this Newsday article about these long-lost twins because these two twins look exactly like David. Specifically, they said you gotta look at these guys' hands. They are just like yours, David. David was known for having these enormous hands, and a lot of the pictures of Bobby and Eddie in the news showed their hands, and they too were enormous. And so David finally picked up a newspaper and looked at a picture of Bobby and Eddie, and sure enough, he was shocked. They looked exactly like him. And then when he read the article, it showed their birthday was July 12th, the same as his, and they were born at the same hospital he was born at. And so he's thinking, these are too many coincidences. They have to be my brothers. And so David called Eddie's home phone number, and Eddie's mother picked up and she asked who was calling. And David said, "Hi, my name is David Kelman. I was born July 12th, 1961, and I'm looking at a newspaper article of two identical twins that look just like me, and one of them is your son. I think I'm the missing third twin." After hearing this, Eddie's mom apparently dropped the phone and yelled out, "They're coming out of the woodwork!" So Eddie and Bobby went to David's house, and as soon as they walked in and saw David, they knew right away he was one of them. He was the third twin. And apparently, within minutes of meeting each other, they were wrestling and laughing hysterically on the ground. It was like, even though they were strangers, they somehow already knew each other and had an instant connection. David's family members that witnessed this first interaction said it was the most incredible thing they had ever seen, that it was just so wonderful to see these long-lost siblings finally reconnected after all these years. Shortly after David realized he was the third missing twin, Newsday did another story talking about how there was actually 3 missing twins that had all been reconnected, and once again, it was just this incredible Cinderella story, and now this story went all over the world. They were on the cover of every magazine, every newspaper, they were on every talk show, and everybody had the same question. What similarities did they discover? And they would say, well, we all wrestled in junior high school and high school. We all smoked the same cigarettes. We liked the same food. We had the same taste in women. And on talk shows, when they would answer these questions, it was immediately clear that they all shared the same mannerisms. And on the show, they would routinely interrupt each other and finish each other's sentences. It really was like they were the exact same person, despite having been raised completely separate from one another. The boys loved the attention they were getting. They had become international rock stars overnight, and all 3 of them were immediately so close. They were best friends right away. They moved into an apartment together. They went out partying. They met Madonna. It was just this incredible time in their lives. And so they weren't asking questions about why they had been separated in the first place. But their parents were asking a lot of questions because they had not been told by the adoption agency that the boy they were adopting actually had 2 identical siblings. They had no idea. So the boys' adoptive parents parents reached out to the adoption agency, which was Louise Wise Services. It's based in New York, very prestigious. Basically, the most powerful and wealthy people in New York use this adoption agency if they're going to adopt. And so the parents reached out to them and asked for a meeting so they could get some answers as to why their kids have been separated. And so the parents go to New York, they go into this meeting room with the top brass of Louise Wise Services, and they say, did you separate our sons at birth on purpose? And one of the executives said, yes, we did, because it's really hard to place 3 children into one home. At which point, David's adoptive father lashed out and said, that's absolute BS. If you had told me he had 2 identical siblings, I would have taken all 3. But the agency stood by their decision and said that's the only reason it happened, and so sorry, that's all we can tell you. And so the parents were very frustrated and felt like there was much more to the story. And in fact, they felt like the agency was actually lying to them about why they had separated their sons in the first place. But they couldn't get any more information, so they left the agency. And right when they got outside, Bobby's father realized he had left his umbrella inside of the meeting room. And so he turned around, went back inside, walked down the hall quietly so he didn't want to disturb anyone. And he opened the door to the meeting room and he reached in to get his umbrella, and he looked inside and he saw the people he had just met with from Louise Wise Services had just opened a bottle of champagne, and they were laughing and smiling, and they were clearly toasting each other on a job well done. And even though Bobby's father did not go in there and confront them about what they were celebrating, he got the sense that they were celebrating having dodged a bullet, that they clearly had just lied to the families of these 3 triplets and they'd gotten away with it. And so between the parents' general sense that the agency was clearly hiding something, and then Bobby discovering this champagne toast as soon as they left, the parents decided they needed to get in touch with some lawyers to help them get to the bottom of why their sons had been separated. And so initially, a number of really prestigious law firms in New York were excited to take this case. But shortly after, they all contacted the families to say, well, actually, there's a conflict and we can't do it anymore. And the parents believed this was because the adoption agency, Louise Wise Services, and some of their more prominent and powerful clients were pressuring the lawyers not to dig into this, that clearly there was some secret that they did not want uncovered. And so unfortunately, the parents hit a dead end and didn't know where else to turn to try to get more information. And so over time, they kind of just accepted that this is just the way it is. And as for their sons, they didn't really care that much because the way they looked at it, at least they had each other now. And so over the years, the boys continued to stay really close. They started families of their own and had lots of family get-togethers. It was just a really happy time in all of their lives. And at some point, the boys actually went into business together and opened their own restaurant in New York called Triplets. And the first year, it was extremely successful, did over $1 million in revenue. But in the second year, the brothers started to fight with each other about how to run the restaurant. And in many ways, this was their first major conflict. They hadn't grown up together. They had never really fought. And so now they're fighting over money and how to run the business. And it got really bad really quick, and they just could not come to any sort of compromise. And so at some point, Bobby left the business. He said, I don't want to do this with you guys anymore. And apparently his departure just completely ruined the dynamic of the 3 brothers. Eddie was the most affected by this fracture in their relationships. All he wanted was for his brothers to be really close and for their families to spend time together. And now all of that was in jeopardy. And so Eddie started showing signs of severe depression and was ultimately hospitalized for 3 weeks. And then shortly after getting out of the hospital, he took his own life. This was beyond devastating for the 2 brothers and the rest of their family. Around this time, a journalist named Lawrence Wright, who had always had a fascination with identical twins, found an obscure scientific article called Psychoanalytic Study of the Child. It detailed a New York-based study about identical twins that were intentionally separated at birth and then given to different adoptive families to be studied, although it wasn't clear what they were actually studying or why they needed identical twins to do this research. In this article, Lawrence discovered all the babies that had been used in the study came from the same adoption agency, the same one the triplets had come from, the Louise Wise Services in New York. And so Lawrence called Bobby and told him that based on this article, it seems like he and his brothers were used in a scientific study. Bobby and David were totally furious. They felt like they'd been treated like lab rats. They also wondered if their being separated at birth had a negative impact on their mental health, and that might have contributed to Eddie's depression and untimely death. Lawrence wound up writing an article about this twin study he had discovered, and after he published it, another set of twins found out they had been a part of the study and discovered themselves. These 2 women were also struggling with depression, furthering the idea that the study could have led to irreparable harm to their subjects' mental well-being. At this point, David and Robbie did not expect anybody to be held accountable for this study. Instead, they just hoped to find out why it was done and what they were testing for and what the results were. and so they began working with Lawrence to try to get those answers. They contacted Louise Wise Services, who did admit that yes, actually this was part of a study, but they didn't give any information about what the results were or why they did it. And so they did some digging, and they discovered the guy in charge of the actual scientific study was this doctor named Peter Neubauer, who was this very well-known psychologist in New York. And so Lawrence managed to get an interview with this doctor, but the doctor basically said, I won't answer any of your questions, and I won't give you any information about this study. And he never published his findings. Right before the doctor died in 2008, he made sure the entire study was put under seal inside of the Yale University archives, so no one could access it until 2066, which has led many people to believe that the reason he set it so far out was to guarantee all of these subjects in this study would have died by the time it was made publicly available, protecting his own legacy and the people that were involved in this study. In the recent documentary called 3 Identical Strangers, Dr. Neubauer's personal assistant, a woman by the name of Natasha Josefowicz, she was interviewed, and they asked her, can you shed any light on why this study was done, what they were testing for, and what the results were? And she would say that she was not actually part of the study. She was more on the periphery, but she was privy to what they were doing. And she said the point of the study was to finally put to bed whether it was nature or nurture that made the person who they ultimately become. Basically, are your surroundings the thing that ultimately makes you who you become, or is it just your genetic makeup, that you're predestined to become a particular person independent of how you were raised? And she said the results were incredible, that basically it has nothing to do with nurture. It's all about your genetic makeup, that we unconsciously trend towards specific behaviors and decisions, but we believe it's free will. We believe we're choosing to do certain things, but in reality, it's basically predetermined. And specifically in the triplets case, Bobby was intentionally placed into a more affluent household where his father was a doctor and his mother was a lawyer. And so they were very well educated, and that was his upbringing. Eddie was placed into a more middle-class family with his father being a teacher and his mom being a stay-at-home mother. And David was put into a low-income household where they were all immigrants, English was a second language, and they just had this very small shop that they owned. And Natasha said this study demonstrated that despite these boys being put into different socioeconomic levels, it had almost no impact on who they ultimately became. She said she doesn't know why the study wasn't published, but she hopes someday it will be. Also, in this documentary, a doctor named Lawrence Perlman, who was actually one of the researchers in the study that would actually make house visits to each of the boys' houses as they were growing up under the false pretext that they were there as part of routine follow-up for the adoption agency. And he went on record and said that the study was not just about the effects of socioeconomic class, it was really about the effects of different styles of parenting. He said in the triplets case, each of the boys had been placed into their respective households after that household had already adopted another child. And that first child they adopted effectively became the guinea pig for this study, where scientists would come in and they would study this child under the false pretext that they were there just following up for the adoption agency, but really they were creating a baseline of how do these parents parent. And then once that baseline was established, then the triplets were sent into their respective homes with the researchers knowing full well how they were each going to be brought up, with the adoptive father being the X factor. Bobby's father, who was a doctor, was rarely around, but he was devoted and loving to his son. David's father, who was the shop owner, was around all the time and adored his son and loved him unconditionally. Eddie's father was a teacher who was around a fair amount, but when he was very strict and rough with Eddie and quick to discipline him and rarely showed any affection for him. And while Dr. Perlman does not come out and say that Eddie's relationship with his father probably had an effect on him becoming depressed and ultimately taking his life, there are many other people close to this case that believe that's exactly what it was, that David and Bobby had a stable, healthy upbringing and Eddie did not. And so when he was faced with the crisis of the brothers separating, Eddie couldn't handle it. These same people refute what Natasha said about the findings of the study that we're all genetically predisposed to become a particular person. They say if that was the case, then why haven't David and Bobby taken their lives? But ultimately, because the study was never published, we won't know for sure why it was done, what they studied, and what the conclusions were. All we have is speculation and second and third hand information. But what we do know for sure is these surviving triplets and their families are furious that this study was done. They feel like it ruined their lives. Following the release of the documentary 3 Identical Strangers, Bobby and David were actually granted early access to the study that was sealed inside of Yale University. And when they looked at it, they were expecting to be blown away with the results, but it turned out it was over 10,000 pages of very technical information, and much of it was heavily redacted, so they couldn't even read most of it. They were not able to deduce what the purpose of the study was in the first place or what it accomplished. It was just all very ambiguous. This study was ultimately shut down permanently in 1980, the same year the triplets discovered themselves. As for the adoption agency, Louise Wise Services, and all the scientists and researchers involved in this study, none of them were held accountable for their role in this totally unethical study. And so basically everything was swept under the rug. And so Bobby, David, and all of the family members of the triplets were just left with a whole bunch of questions and not a lot of answers.